Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Redpill, joined as always by my eminent co-host, Dr. Benway. Dr. Benway, how are you today?
I'm feeling very eminent in the field of whatever thing they gave me a degree in.
Well, they gave you a doctorate in whatever it is that you're supposed to be a doctor in, you know? It could be anything, and we're not going to go there. Anyway, what are we going to talk about?
Well, you had mentioned that you had some thoughts on museums, and it has some place in society that's worthy of discussion. So I'd love to hear more.
Okay, well, look, this is a fly by the seat of your pants kind of podcast today, because I actually didn't do any research. Time just grabbed me and just would not let go insofar as all the tidbits that I had to do, the trivia that sort of like accumulates in your life. And I couldn't research the notion of when did museums come into vogue? When was it that people decided, hey, let's make this big old building with a lot of money, a very expensive building, and fill it with the bric-a-bracs and knickknacks and what have yous of our history and society and culture. And a lot of money has been spent on museums. Do you know the history, actually?
Well, that's easy. It's when the people stopped going to church. I mean, that's basically when it happened.
You think that was it's as simple as that?
Think about how the museum is structured.
Yeah,
It's
like a
supposed
church.
to be in there. You go in. It's very contemplative. It's a very large building. You have some illuminated texts and whatnot. It's a curation of art, which historically had either been curated by the church itself or very wealthy private individuals. So you have a little bit of both influences feeding into this thing. One, you have, like I said, the religious connotation of some sort of spiritual enlightenment, but you also have the aristocratic noblesse oblige idea of having all of this cultivation brought forth in a public way. And, we're cultivating the cities that we have. There's going to be some sort of enrichment project that's going on so that your average individual, once they enter these buildings, will have some sort of experience, some sort of knowledge of all of these great things that we have hitherto collected. And like I said, it seems to me a very clear attempt to replace religion in some capacity with a more constructed view on what the good life is and how it should be depicted and how it should be consumed.
But museums, when did they start really coming into vogue in the West? Like in the 19th century, I guess? So that would more or less coincide with the downturn in religiosity. Although the real downturn in religiosity, you could argue, happened after the First World War. But it was really in the 19th century that they started coming into vogue. The great museums, the Victoria and Albert Museum and what have you. I mean, I've been to it. I've been to most of the great museums in the West. And some of them are truly, I mean, it's just breathtaking. Like, how can I put it? Like, I'd heard about the Louvre for years, right? And over the years and decades, really, I've studied so much history, art history. And so I know all these paintings, everything from the obvious, like the Mona Lisa, all the way to the obscure. And when I went to the Louvre, I was living in Paris at the time. This was in 2011, 2012 or so. And I went to the Louvre, and it's enormous. And to do the Louvre, as they say, in a day is impossible, okay? And I was pretty clever about it, to tell you the truth. I decided that I was going to spread it out over several days. But stupidly, I thought I would do it on consecutive days. And so it was like on the first day I went to just a few sections, a very delineated scope of the museum. And I really enjoyed the art. I went to see actually the great paintings, the famous ones. And then on the second day, I went to a different section. A third day, I went to a different section. And by the third day, I was exhausted in terms of my imagination. Because it was just mentally just so much material to look at and appreciate. I was exhausted. It's kind of ridiculous when I say it this way, but I was just mentally wrung out by the third day. In fact, on the third day, I couldn't complete my tour. I cut it short by half. But the point I wanted to make, though, is that, I went on the first day of my tour of the Louvre, and I saw so many of the great paintings that I'd heard over the years. And the thing that struck me most, what sort of like shocked me, was that most of these paintings were far larger than I'd been taught, because I'd only ever seen these images in a book or perhaps on a computer screen. Uh, Very rarely. I had some art history classes back in college, and I saw a couple of paintings and such, projected, but I didn't have much of a memory. And of course, it was a projector, so it didn't look very good. It looked all washed out and all the rest of it. This was the first time I'm seeing these paintings in their actual size, and most of them are enormous, and they were so much more powerful than in the book. And that was the memory that struck me the most of going to the Louvre, for instance. That the paintings, were just much more powerful. And oddly enough, the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting of them all at the Louvre, seemed trivial because it's actually quite small. And what was funny about it when I saw it was all of these people taking pictures of the Louvre and taking selfies of themselves with the Louvre, right? With the Mona Lisa. They were taking pictures of the Mona Lisa, taking selfies of the Mona Lisa, and it seemed faintly ridiculous because all around them were better paintings. Because that's the other thing I realized, that the Mona Lisa is not that, it's no great shakes, really. It's some of the other stuff at the Louvre was far better, far more powerful, far more interesting and ambiguous and thought-provoking than the Mona Lisa. And yeah, I'm sort of like going at random about this particular topic.
Well, to me, it's always been a mix in terms of the sizes. Like, for example, I've always noticed that whenever I see Francis Bacon paintings, they're always larger than you get the impression in the books. But when I see paintings like Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, for example, it's much smaller when you see it in reality. My take on museums is absolutely a bit different, because I know that when you tend to go to museums now, it's very similar to when you go on a vacation somewhere. It's like, okay, everybody, we have to see all these things. We have to go now. We have to go to this room, then to this room, then to that room. To me, you're just going to miss the point of half of the battle of going to look at these things. If you're just there to fly by night, see them and say, oh, there it physically is, and move on. Well, you could just as easily get that out of the book.
Yeah.
You're still especially today, the quality of the images that are produced in books are actually very high quality, and you don't even need to buy the book. You can see it on 99% of the time. To me, it's more of the matter of being there and having a moment of contemplation, if you will, exploring particular pieces. Like when I go, I tend to repeat visit. Well, in Chicago, the Art Institute is my favorite of the museums. And when I go to, if I'm in New York, usually it's the Met or the MoMA. MoMA more so for my interest, and just based on what they have. But to me, I tend to have a more gingerly approach to it. To me, there's an attitude and an experience and that I'm trying to enjoy when I'm at the museum. And I don't feel the need to have to do this fly by night and say, oh, I have to hit everything.
Mm.
But people tend to think that way. And I think they go so fast, so much, that I don't know what purpose the museum is serving for them other than to fill a day. You know what I mean? It seems like, oh, it's an activity we do.
Yeah,
And
they're consuming the day. They're consuming the day. They're consuming culture.
in a very kind of digestible kind of way.
Mm.
Either I see all the paintings, we're moving on. Oh, the paintings are organized by historic artistic period. Oh, that makes it even better. I know, that this tells me what I need to know about modernism, whatever, or cubism, as so happens to be, or the particular artist. And oh, by the way, you can buy that little audio tape so that when you're going around, you have a nice pre-digested understanding of what all these painting means, who the artist is, so on and so forth. And even better, when you leave the museum, you could get a pencil case with Edvard Munch's The Scream on it,
Yeah.
because that proves that you were there.
Yeah.
It proves you understood it.
Yeah.
And it was worth
Yeah.
uh,
I admit, I went to the Louvre, and one of the first things I did before I even saw some of the paintings was buy myself a mug to show that I'd been there. But like for instance, when I saw these people who would go through the painting like it's the thing to do to check off your list, check off the famous bucket list. I despise that approach to living. of checking off things, of, oh, I did this, did that, where the whole point of life is to experience it. And one of the most, to me, the Louvre was memorable because, as I said, I went there in 2011 or 12, and what happened was I was there. I in the end I spent roughly 9 days at the Louvre during the period I was living in Paris, and I saw most of it. Though I do know that I missed out on a couple of spots, but it doesn't matter. But I kept going back to it because on the second day something remarkable happened to me that I consider myself very, very fortunate. That, see, I was going through the Louvre, I was going through the paintings, this, that, the other, all very nice, this, that, blah, blah. And by chance, I came across this little nook in the museum. I was actually on my way to the cafeteria. And I came across this little nook where there was this painting, a lone painting, a quite large painting. It was the execution of the Lady Jane Grey by Delaroche. Paul, right. And the execution of the Lady Jane Grey is a fairly large painting. I guess it's about 7 feet tall and about 8 feet wide, I'd guess, something like that. I saw it, it caught me by surprise. And to tell you the truth, I was unfamiliar with it. And I saw it, and the power of it struck me just instantly, viscerally. It was this sense in my gut that this was something important. This was a powerful and important painting. And I had no context for it at all. I had no idea what it was even depicting when I saw it for the first time. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's quite simple. It's a quite simple painting. It's a young woman, Lady Jane Grey, who was briefly the Queen of England in the 16th century before she was executed on the orders of Queen Elizabeth. She is being led to the butcher's block, quite frankly. There's a block of wood where she will be beheaded. And her executioner is looking on. And there's this older gentleman in a heavy cloak, sort of like guiding her forward because she's blindfolded. And she's wearing this white dress. And she's wearing a white blindfold. And her ladies in waiting are off to the side wailing as the Lady Jane Grey is about to be executed. And it was quite powerful to me because I was struck by the fact that I understood that the women who were wailing were her ladies in waiting or some sort of courtiers of some sort. But they weren't looking at the Lady Jane Grey. They were looking away. They were actually looking at their own fates and wailing at their fate because now that their mistress was going to die, what would befall them? But the executioner and the man who is, I don't know who he was supposed to be represented as, but who is leading her to the executioner's block, they look at her with compassion, and it was very powerful to me. Okay, and I like I said, when I first saw it, I didn't understand the context of it, and that moment of seeing a painting that I was unfamiliar with and being so moved by it, and being struck by its intelligence, by its compassion, its humanity, its not cynicism, but realism about how courts work and how the politics works. It was like the full package. And I was so moved by the painting. And that feeling of surprise, it's like the first time you hear The Dark Side of the Moon or Stairway to Heaven. It's like the first time you watch The Godfather. It's like the first time you experience something not just novel, but exceptional. It was such a satisfying feeling and such a happy emotion, And there's other paintings that I've experienced like that. There's an obscure painting called Fairman Rogers' Four in Hand, which is a very simple painting of a four in hand, a carriage of four horses being pulled along. And it's like a perfectly composed little painting. And it's kind of trivial. And I saw it at the National Gallery in Washington. And again, I was so moved by that. And that experience, that high, that's why I love going to museums, because I see the paintings and most of them don't move me, the vast majority, but I'm looking for that high. I'm looking for that hit. I imagine it's what junkies, heroin addicts are looking for when they get heroin, to feel that hit that just sends you to the moon. Yeah, that's the feeling.
Well, it's interesting to me is that it seems that the museums in general, the museums of today, though, intentionally kind of limit the context that's important to enjoy, I think, a lot of these pieces. For example, I mean, yes, I could go into the museum whenever I want, frankly, and enjoy a number of the paintings I know that are going to be there. Oftentimes, I think that my enjoyment of a particular piece over the other oftentimes relates to the context that I'm familiar with of the piece, be it either historically being aware of what's being depicted or the artist, whatever. The museum itself, especially today, I don't know how it was in the old days. Yes, they try to curate themes or they try to show a painter's retrospective, but by and large, it's just very just little nuggets of, oh, this depicts that, this is that. You don't really have a chance to just sit and enjoy, like, well, I'm kind of curious and enjoy why this painting is doing what it's doing. What is it depicting? What is it kind of representing from the artist's point of view, state of mind, what have you? And it's more like, here's this thing, enjoy it on the terms that we demand that you enjoy it. So it can be odd in that regard. In the weird thing with museums as well, and you get this more so when if you ever hit the modern or contemporary wings of a museum, is that you have this phenomenon which artists have played off of intentionally, where frankly anything in the museum, if you situate it in the right way, can be treated as an exhibit for your attention. Like
Mm.
if you take the fire extinguisher and you put a little border and line around it, people will think it's a piece
Yeah, I
in the
know.
museum.
It's happened many times. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the joke that people play, and the museum to me now, especially if you hit those modern rings, is an attempt to play off of the fact that the museum, in many ways, can be a joke.
Yeah.
I honestly think that the authors or the painters who will do things like black canvas and have a date on it, like October 31st, 1968, which is in the Art Institute of Chicago, is playing a joke on you.
Yeah. But
I
it's the
honestly
same
think they
joke.
are.
It's the same joke. It's funny once. A joke is funny once, maybe twice, or even three times. But after that, it's just boring. And it seems to be the same joke of just crap that's just strewn there in a minimalist setting inside a museum, in one of these white boxes of a museum. And it's supposed to represent something. What does it represent? It doesn't represent anything. It's just you're being taken for a ride. I agree. I fully agree. One of the museums I went to was the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, which is one of the largest modernist and postmodernist museums in the world, and it's quite spectacular. But it just seemed like a curated yard sale. You know,
Hmm.
all the stuff, yeah, sure, but it just seemed stupid. Ultimately, nothing seemed to have any craft to it. Okay, I mean, I'm actually looking at the painting of the execution of the Lady Jane Grey, and it was painted, right, oil on canvas in the 19th century. And I'm looking at the dress. It's this white silver dress, silk dress, and it's like a photograph. It's stunning. It's stunning craft. Now you can say, well, that doesn't add anything to the painting. Oh, yeah, it just sure, but the craft to do that, it speaks of something. It speaks of something both grand and something that was very hard to arrive at. That kind of craft is not easy to come by. Okay, it takes decades of just doing it over and over and over again until you're able to master that technique, that craft, to be able to do a dress and see the folds of the fabric so real that it's happening right before your eyes, right? And just having as a counterpoint to that, these postmodern paintings or art pieces or whatever, where it's like you said, a black canvas with a date on it, and that's supposed to mean something to me. That doesn't mean anything. It's just stupid.
Well, I mean, I let me put it this way: I don't adopt the attitude like you'll get over Paul Joseph Watson, who just summarily thinks that all modern art is trash. I think that's a trivial excuse to
I
not
agree.
have to worry about paying. to it.
I agree.
I do think, yes, it's clear in postmodernism in particular, you get a lot more of that. But if you look at, the paintings of like the Impressionists, going back to the Impressionists, or going to like the Francis Bacon's, could these guys draw the actual realistic representations that you would get in the Renaissance paintings if they wanted to? Yes, they could if they pushed them there. But they know through the historic development of the artistic process that oftentimes those realistic paintings were in some regards fictions and lies, right? I mean, it's a conception of the reality that the ordered society would want you to have, and sometimes having weirder shit gets to a truth of the matter sooner.
Yeah.
For example, a great painting, it's a politically motivated painting, is liberty leading the people. It's literally literalized the concept of liberty as a woman bearing her breast leading people through the streets of Paris.
Right.
That is, there's nothing realistic.
She's
about
actually
that
a
painting.
Giantess because she's
exactly.
Yeah.
And there's the whole. I mean, there's a whole series of exercises where people realize that the very act of doing what you're doing here is worth consideration, and that's why the paintings look increasingly odd. I do, but the thing is, now with museums, to keep it on our theme, it just feels like we're trying to, especially the more contemporary you get, is just prepping the art market, as it were. It's like, oh, this steel balloon, blow up balloon of whatever animals that what's his face does.
Jeffrey Koons.
Jeffrey Koons is
he does like puppies and stuff. Yeah,
exactly.
Balloon puppy or whatever. Yeah,
it's in this museum or that museum. Therefore, go buy it. Those of you who have like a copy, because he doesn't even make his own paintings now. He has people produce them.
Well, he never made them, as I understand it. It was always like, yeah.
But honestly, like in museums, though, funny enough, like, because the reason I bring this up is when I say, I'll make my criticisms of postmodern art very clearly. But when I go to the museums, the paintings that invariably I'm most interested in seeing are the sort of mid-century paintings, mid-20th century paintings, the modernism. To me, the best painting experience I had was when I saw Francis Bacon's painting of 1946 in the Museum of Modern Art. That's one of the series of cycles where he has a lot of the hanging meat and the screaming faces kind of thing. That was one where it was huge. If you actually go and see it, I've never really seen it in person before. I'd only seen one or two Francis Bacon paintings before, and that kind of impression, whatever you want to call it, was the stuff that I'm always very interested in, because it's the stuff that often is articulating the anxieties that are coming about along the lines of the end of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what's funny to me about museum, you are seeing, whether the artists know it or not, this anxiety over what's happening to the people around them and to the world they're living in. And it just seems to me what's so disturbing about the museum in a way is that it feels like this anxiety over something that continues to happen is not preserved in amber, and in being preserved, it's it's just a thing. You can go and consume it at the museum, and then you go home and you don't worry about it. Or you almost castrate the point of the art to begin with. I feel like I'm the one knocking museums on this discussion, but I do have these weird feelings going into the museum, like this is being prepackaged in a way to make everything kind of digestible and safe.
Well, how could I put it? Look, my museum going experience dates back. The first museum I remember going to was the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian, when I was about 10 years old. And I was blown away because I was into space and rocketry and Apollo and Viking and all that stuff, because I was a kid. I was a 10-year-old boy. I mean, it would have been weird if I hadn't wanted to be an astronaut, at least for a few years, right? But that was the first experience of a museum I had. But it's only as an adult, as a man in my 40s, quite frankly, that I started realizing how important museums actually were. Now, I'd gone to museums, frankly, a lot of times I went them to just tick them off my list, especially in my 30s. I remember when I moved to New York, I was 32 at the time, or 30 at the time, sorry. And I went to the Guggenheim and I went to MoMA, and it was just, ticking them off my list. And I looked at the things and I experienced them and I appreciated some of them. But I didn't I didn't go, I think, to myself in the right mood. And I didn't
Mm.
prepare myself. Because, like, for instance, when I went to the Louvre in 2011, at the time I was 43 years old, and 43, 44. And I was much more prepared. I actually had a plan as to what rooms I was going to see in what order. And I did like a cursory look at what paintings were there and sort of like get a little bit of the history and to refamiliarize myself with the paintings there. Not something that in depth. I mean, I wasn't like a nerd about it, but I sort of like just wanted to get a sense of like, okay, I'll see these paintings and there'll be a reason to see them, to appreciate them. And I want to be able to appreciate them and get a lot out of them. And so I did. And I think that that was the right approach. There were certain sections, like for instance, the Egyptian section, the famous Egyptian section, where I just sort of like experienced it. I didn't bother prepping for it because I didn't know enough about Egyptology and shit like that. I mean, I wasn't going to spend the time for it, so I just decided I just experienced the knickknacks they'd have there on their face, and I had a wonderful time. But insofar as the paintings were concerned, I took my time about it. And what I was struck was how exhausting it was to really be appreciating the paintings, as opposed to sort of like looking at them and like moving along. And because I realize now that most of the times I'd gone to a museum, I'd been looking at stuff and then moving along instead of actually appreciating it. And there's something else. So much of contemporary art, I realized, was not worth contemplating. I mentioned the Ludwig Museum, and so much of those art pieces, postmodern art pieces, the more you contemplated them and thought about them and looked at them, the less there was. And that was interesting to me because it was art that there. It wasn't that there was no profundity to it. It's that at first glance there seemed to be profundity, but the more you dug, the less there was somehow. I don't quite know how to make a metaphor to explain that. But you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I mean, well, there's less to look at the more you think about it. Exactly.
Yeah.
To me, the most disappointing museum I've ever been to was the Tate Modern.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
the museum in and of itself is unpleasant.
Yeah.
It's a series of escalators going up to nothing.
Yeah.
Uh, and yes, they have some interesting things there, but it just feels like London, the worst parts of London in
Yeah.
many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Everything you
was
want to think
there.
about it, which the oddity is, like I said, one of my favorite museums though is the MoMA, which is kind of trying to show similar types of paintings, but be it through their cultivation and even the fucking way that their space is laid out, just feels a little less oppressive
Yeah.
than the Tate does. It's
Yeah.
very strange. I mean, it oftentimes now with museums, I'm like 50% focused on the building as much as I am the art now. Like, for example, you go into some of the older museums, or you go into the older wing of the Art Institute or the Met, you'd mentioned the Louvre, or even the Philadelphia Museum. You get the impression that you're going through an 18th century house in many
Right.
strong ways. The way that the paintings are being displayed, the parquet floor that has those creaks.
Hmm.
Almost all the British museums are like this. The Louvre is even the perfect example because it was the old royal house
Mm.
for the French nation. You have that vibe. It's like, oh, this is the aristocratic realm we're going in. But you start going to the modern section. You have everything stripped down to almost either it's better wood or it's like weird concrete, smoothed concrete, a lot of glass,
Yeah.
a lot of weird shapes. You could tell they're trying to do a modernist cathedral,
Yeah.
right? You can clearly get a sense of the intention for you in these spaces. So I start paying attention to that stuff as well. The whole thing, when you create a space where the person is in the contemplative mood, you start everything becomes the subject of contemplation, including, as I said, literally the space itself. And
Yeah.
it does, especially when, and maybe I noticed this more in the contemporary section because usually the contemporary art pieces I'm not very interested in. I start losing interest once you start getting shit that was produced in the 60s, 70s. Not to say it's a perfect demarcation line. It's just I notice I'm less interested once you start getting there.
Hmm.
And it's just something that I see happening in the museums that I pay attention to.
Well, what happened to me about the Tate Gallery, for instance, it's funny you should mention that. I saw that museum, I don't know, just a few months ago, and I can't remember any work in it. I remember the building very clearly, but I'm not kidding around. I cannot recall a single piece of art there. It was just this big cavernous space. I recall the store better than any painting there, and there was a cafeteria, and yeah, but the museum itself, I mean the pieces in the museum rather, they were of no interest whatsoever. I don't recall any of them. Ditto with the Saatchi Gallery. I went to the Saatchi Gallery, and I don't recall anything. Oh no, there's one thing I recall. There was this one weird little sculpture that had this projector on it, okay, and it cast a shadow of a figure. I don't even recall the figure, what it was. It was a face. It was a face of a. It was actually like a two face, like a Janus, like a two-headed, two-faced creature.
Yeah.
But the sculpture itself was made of just like nuts and bolts and just like random crap. It was only with the light aimed from a certain point that you saw the perfect figures, right? And I thought that was clever, but just clever. A lot of craft, a lot of skill and effort and time went into creating it, but it was not. It didn't move me in any way. It was just a random face or two faces. I think it was two faces. I can't recall, to tell you the truth, because the shadow that was cast was not even that interesting. Okay, and that's what I've noticed of so much of our art as of late. It has enormous skill, some of it. I'm thinking specifically of so much CGI in films, right? Enormous skill,
Mm-hmm.
but in the service of nothing very memorable or nothing very intelligent or interesting, you know? And that's what I thought in the thing. Oh, and there was another one that had like this, like it was like some sort of Twitter thing that was going on. It was like projected onto a wall, but again, it was like empty. It didn't feel like anything at all. It was just grossly
Well,
disappointing.
yeah.
You know.
Well, it could be by virtue of me just having gone here endless times. It just seems that it was weird to me to see how inconsequential the collection was at the Tate. It seemed that I would have expected more. Maybe it's because when I go to the Art Institute of Chicago, I had mentioned, Nighthawks there. But if I go down the list of paintings, you will recognize invariably all of the ones I would say. George Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jetée, Pablo Picasso's Old Guitarist. It's one of the blue paintings
Yeah.
series he's done. Rembrandt, The Old Man with the Gold Chain. Any number of Renoir pieces, a lot of Vincent van Gogh, Magritte's, I forget the name of it, but it's the train coming out of the mantelpiece.
Mm-hmm.
Um, American Gothic. You go through these, a lot of Modigliani. These are known paintings, and the collection is, rather intense. I would have expected that this high emblem of the London art world would have had more. It surprisingly didn't. Maybe, which is why I don't really remember much about the Tate other than what wasn't there.
Yeah.
I remember the British Portrait Gallery very well. I
Mhm.
remember the National Museum, the various museums
Yeah.
in that area.
DNA. Yeah.
Exactly. And, nothing of the Tate, and it was very strange because usually when you think about these big museums, you would have expected them to have all of this shit ready to go. And
Well,
it's
it's
part
a,
of the
the
identity.
I think that these museums like the Saatchi and the Tate and other such hip quote unquote museums and galleries, it's to make a scene, it's not important. It's like things that are fashionable are fundamentally trivial, and that's a truism. That which is fashionable is just of the moment. It's ephemeral. And I think that that's the problem with the Tate and the Saatchi Gallery, that they were trying to be fashionable. They want to be up to the moment. They want to be quote unquote modern, young, because the Brits have this weird thing of that, they want to be very modern, always modern. I don't quite understand why. Modern in not modernist sense, but rather modern in being up to the moment. And precisely because they try to be up to the moment, they become very quickly passé and immemorable. ephemeral. It just like just flitters off your mind. Because I'm
Which is why I like in Chicago that we have a museum of contemporary art, which it's perfect. You separate out the Vogue
mm,
from the more recent, but obviously worth your time work that you would have at the main museum. And it's funny when I go to the Museum of Contemporary Art now. Yes, and I rarely go to it, but I do. Um, yes, it will have contemporary pieces. But what's interesting to me is that there is a big focus now. If you ever go on anything that's contemporary, they will look at the art of design of products you can buy. Very often, you will see. I like the MoMA, and I even own this chair, but it makes me laugh to know that the Aeron chair from Herman Miller is an exhibit
yeah.
in, I think, MoMA. Yeah.
Well, I do think that there are some elements of industrial design that can be qualified as art. There are certain pieces that do qualify as art. Um, like for example, there was I mentioned it to you earlier before we started recording that at the Guggenheim I once saw this exhibit on motorcycles, and people were outraged, motorcycles, blah blah. But there is a great beauty to some motorcycles, even if they are mass produced. There are some motorcycles that are, in a weird way, timeless. For example, there's a famous one, the Honda CB 750. 754. Okay, 750 is 750 with the word four, and it was a motorcycle that looks like a classic motorcycle in a timeless way. It's almost like a platonic ideal of what a motorcycle should look like. Okay.
Mhm.
And that's very powerful. And there are different motorcycles, from before the war that are really interesting. And some of them have a design, a look to them that is weirdly appealing, and it starts making you wonder why you like it so much. I mean, it appeals even to people who don't like motorcycles, who don't ride motorcycles. But the beauty of the object, and I can understand that. The MoMA famously has that. What was the name of that helicopter? The one that had like the bubble cockpit that was used a lot in the Korean War. That's always in the at the opening shots of the
Ash.
of MASH, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that
forget the
that
name of it, but I
yeah.
know the
You
helicopter.
know what
Yeah.
I'm talking about, right? So that helicopter, they have one, an actual one at the MoMA, or I don't know if they still have it. They did when I was living in New York, and they had it there, and it's interesting. It's an interesting looking thing. It looks like a bug. It looks like an insect, with that round plexiglass bubble of a cockpit, where the people in it seem so curiously vulnerable, right? And yet at the same time so insect-like. It's an interesting object. Okay, and I find that interesting to discuss an object. When exactly does it stop being simply functional and become some sort of weird art? Okay, this is a valid
Well,
question.
what that's interesting is you have there's a whole category of museums that are kind of somewhat removed from the question of art, and there would be what I would call the industrial history museum. So like the Museum of
But
Science and Industry in
yeah,
Chicago is that, but it's different because I would stress, yes, you could think of it as a work of art, but that is more of a museum of
of history,
how things are or history or
right?
how things work. Like when you mentioned that helicopter, I know there are sometimes when if you go into these pieces, because sometimes you're allowed to go in, you think to yourself, how did they not cook under this bubble
Yeah,
glass and literally like become dinner in the afternoon with
yeah,
the sun
yeah.
focused on it? Or when I number of times I've been in museums where I've gone into the fuselage of a Concorde,
Hmm.
and I think to myself, how could people not have hit their heads 90% of the time when they're getting in this
They
thing?
did.
It is like a slender, yeah, it's the slender little thing. It's very interesting when you go in there because then the the philosophical or contemplative question you are confronted with is different. Yes, you can sometimes think, oh, there's a lot of artistry in here, and that's a legitimate question, but it's more, why did we make this when, and what was the point of it, and what did I learn because of it? And like I said, places like the Museum of Science and Industry are great at this stuff. They'll even do exhibits like discovering electricity. What the hell does it mean when you say an electron does this or that? And they'll demonstrate it. And I think that stuff is, I
Well,
think, very
that's
valuable, even though
different.
it
That's very different.
oftentimes gets it's secondary. It gets a secondary attention
Yeah.
relative to the traditional museum.
Well, I have great respect for historical museums that try to show you the objects of the past. Yeah, they're called museums, but let's separate between art and objects. You know that have been collected and curated to show you a history that I find different. Even though, of course, there is the history of art and how art developed through time and the different paintings and schools and what have you. But looking at how could I put this? Separating between the history and the aesthetic experience. I
Hmm.
don't have a problem, for instance, at all of museums that show me, industrial processes and such. And I'm interested in like the first locomotive or the first car or the first plane or whatever. I find that interesting. I think that it is actually important for us to learn how certain things came about. And sometimes actually seeing it right there in front of you and them saying, this was the first automobile, and it worked because of this reason. And this little engine it had was like 1.5 horsepower, right? And it ran and it drove on. It was a horseless carriage. I find that interesting, and I find that seeing it in person gives a different experience. There was I went to a museum in Los Angeles, the Automobile Museum, of course, in Los Angeles, right? The city that the people are the guests, the real inhabitants are the cars. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
it was fascinating. There were all kinds of cars, and I didn't have a problem with that. Some of the cars were attractive or pretty cars, or others were very, very ugly, but they all had a purpose in the story of the automobile, right? But what I guess is when I guess my objection is when bric-a-brac is just put together just for the sake of bric-a-brac, and it doesn't really tell you anything. Like for instance, in some museums, you'll find like cases full of little like buttons and hundreds of variations of buttons, and it doesn't really add anything. I'm just taking an example at random insofar as buttons are concerned, but you know what I mean. When you have these cases, row after row of these cases of something trivial that,
And and that's probably the sign of a lazy museum
yeah,
curator, because I can think of an example where the buttons are of interest to me. When I was in Britain, one of the museums I really liked is when I went to Greenwich, and it was the Maritime Museum, where you
hmm,
had the history of the British Navy,
yeah,
and you actually saw a lot of the uniforms
right,
that they had in the evolution over time, and they did feature the buttons and how it evolved. And part of the story is, well, uniforms weren't so uniform for a very long time until they actually had standards imposed, and you see how the rules kind of changed for these things, and things became more standardized.
yeah,
And a kind of wonderful conclusion to all of this is that you've got that build up, but then the centerpiece that they show is Nelson's uniform, the one he wore the day he was killed,
hmm,
and you actually see the bullet hole in the fucking thing, and you see what he was wearing and how the patches were worn on his coat. It's a very interesting little thing, but that's the result of someone who knows what they're doing, as opposed to someone who says, "I need to fill some space. Let's get some fucking buttons in
yeah,
here."
exactly, exactly. Okay. And by the way, I don't even recall seeing anything like buttons like that, but I do recall seeing row after row of something incredibly boring. In Chile, there were all these pre-Columbian museums, and they had all this
Mm.
garbage that was just so boring, like fucking, arrowheads, thousands of them, and in the States too. Come on, don't give me that. There are like lots of them out in Wyoming. You have like museums with row after row of arrowheads. It might be interested to a specialist, but how many people are such specialists? Very, very few compared to the number of people
Well,
who
that,
wind
and
up
that's
going.
a and that's a byproduct of a lot of this feeling the need for representation. Like,
Oh
why
yeah,
isn't there a museum about the history of Black folks, or the history of these ancient civilizations before Columbus got here? Well, the truth of the matter is, you'll be done with it in 2 minutes, because there's very little
yeah,
interesting to see.
yeah.
And I know that some people would offend it by that, but at
It's the
this point, if
truth.
I'm worried about who I've offended, I think I've come a little bit too late to the party.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say, you will there aren't museums of non-Western things that are of interest to me. One of the great, and I bring this museum up because it's a wonderful kind of in between the aesthetic museum and the history museum.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite little museums is in the University of Chicago campus is the Oriental Institute, and there you will get,
By the
and
way, it's still called the Oriental Institute.
it
I'm
is still called the Oriental
I'm
Institute.
shocked.
They're not changing it. It's carved in stone, literally. But
Good for them.
what's great about it is because you can tell there's going to be certain kinds of people who'd be offended by this museum, because this was literally from the period of the early 20th century, which is go to the Arab states, take their artistic shit, and run back home.
Yeah.
So you have these gargantuan pieces that were literally from the ancient world. You have this great, gigantic. I don't even know how they could get it out of the building now, because I think it was put in when the building was under construction. The great Lamassu from Sargon's palace, which is this, the human-headed bull creature. It's this gigantic thing, and you have this 15-foot tall statue of either Tutankhamun or one of the successors of that dynasty. There, all of the big pieces, and you cannot in this country see any pieces from Persia. You can't see almost any Persian pieces out of Iran, except at the University of Chicago Oriental Institute.
Really?
You actually do have, pieces from the Palace of Persepolis. Yeah, and in fact, it was part of in like 2006, there was some, when I was there, actually, there was some crazy shit where the Persians wanted their shit back, and
Sure.
Persians, the Iranians wanted their shit back.
Yeah.
Our university was like, no, we don't trust you, and no, we're not giving it up. I think we won, but still, that was a big thing. And so that's an interesting piece where, you have some rooms that are filled with like early pottery shard pieces that, some people care about, most people don't. But you then quickly get into, this is the bits of the palaces. These are the reliefs that you got from the Great Gate at, I always forget where the city was, but what was the name of that major gate where it had all of the drawings and the depictions on it of Babylon? The gates of Babylon, essentially, I think, is where we have pieces of it. All of that wonderful stuff is there to be, interestingly consumed, because then you have both elements. You see, oh, look at all this artistic expression that's going on, but it's the piece of the fucking palace as well. So you are getting a sense of what this place was like when people walked through it during the time.
There's something else, though, that, okay, look, let's look at it in these terms. If you just accumulate everything that ever existed in the world, just accumulate everything, and then that's impossible in a practical sense, right? A museum is only collecting certain things. And the decision of what you choose to collect in a museum, what does it express exactly? Because by choosing to collect, say, this painting and not that painting, this little bric-a-brac from an ancient civilization and not that other bric-a-brac, what are you communicating? You're communicating a point of view. You're communicating that this particular painting was important, this other one was not. I'm looking at my children's paintings, right? My children are toddlers. And of course, their paintings are the kind of paintings that you would expect a toddler to make. Now, nobody else gives a shit about these little paintings, right? I have 6 of them, and for me, they're quite valuable, right? And I hold them there. I hang them there in my office, in my studio. And, there'll come a time where they'll be replaced by other little paintings that my children make, and I'll be very carefully put them away and for safekeeping, and they will be precious to me. Because if my children are important, and of course their works of art are trivial, they're not very good because I don't have a Picasso in the house, unfortunately, because I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to live in my old age? And I was hoping one of them would be like a Picasso or a Roger Federer, and I don't think that they're going to be either one of those things. But in a serious note, what you choose determines what you find important. Who is supposed to choose for you? Because we are basically delegated to museum curators the task of picking the objects that are important to save. Why should we trust them? Why should we allow them to do this? Because what they pick will give us a vision of our society and our past, right? Do we allow them this power? Because frankly, you and I agree that the universities over the last 20 years have produced a bunch of retards who are basically ideologically driven, who have an ideology that is essentially a religion that views privilege as the original sin. And these retards are slowly creeping up the career ladders of the cultural institutions that we have. We've already seen them destroy publishing. They've destroyed comic books. They are in the process of destroying video games and film, an art form that is very near and dear to you and me. And so eventually they're going to be at the leadership, at the helm of museums. What are they going to choose to throw away? What are they going to choose to hold on to and raise up as important the important tokens of our civilization? I'm actually worried, to tell you the truth, because I think that these fucking idiots are going to raise up things that are not important and shuffle off, if not throw away, that which is. I mean, the fucking Swedes, wasn't it the Swedes or not the Norwegians and not the Finns? I think it was the Swedes who like threw away a bunch of Viking stuff, because they just like, oh, fuck it, we don't need it anymore. And it was like a whole truckload of Viking artifacts that they threw away. And it was their civilization, their culture, and they threw it away because of multiculturalism,
Well, that certainly sounds like Sweden. What's surprising to me is that if it were to happen, I would have expected it to have already happened. I mean, when you talk about the artistic and the art history or the art educated group of folk, right? I mean, they've already been exposed to left-wing thinking. It's been so for a very long time. So to me, like if they would have made a move, I'm surprised they wouldn't have made it already. So I don't know fundamentally why it hasn't, because it's not like if you go, like I said, into the Art Institute, suddenly all the work of these old dead white men are disappeared. You do see emphasis placed on the modern section, and you do see them trying to display representation and all of that, but they can't deny all the history. At least they haven't done that yet. Now, historically, though, in a lot, particularly when you go back to your art as political engagement movements, somewhat Dadaistic and others, and even more contemporary stuff, you will see assholes who try to go in and destroy old paintings for various political or quote unquote aesthetic reasons. I can envision someone like that coming around saying, how he didn't really do it. He reproduced the painting and did this, but how Magritte would put the mustache on the Mona Lisa. He didn't do it to the actual Mona Lisa. He recreated the Mona Lisa and then drew a little mustache on her as a way of poking fun at it. But there will be people who I'm pretty sure will take an axe to this old stuff and slash this shit or will do their little stunts. I expect it to happen. Things like that are part of, because people love to think, especially now, because I feel like the emphasis on the skills to create the plastic arts is less and less important. And what's more and more important in the artistic community is the quote unquote performance art. And you will always get an asshole who thinks that destroying something is a piece of performance art, and it will be reflected on that. And I know that someone, give it some time. They'll go to one of the main paintings that was depicted by someone who didn't fit the right rules of who was great. They'll destroy it. Yeah. They'll get publicity and notoriety, and they'll go down in the history books as this great moment of performance art.
Yeah, well, because that lady who like repainted the Jesus face in some
the restoration that really didn't restore well.
Yeah, well, the lady was ignorant. So in a very real sense, I can forgive her. I mean, I think that she was an idiot, but I can forgive her. But these performance artists, I can't forgive them because they know better. Because this woman was an ignorant buffoon who probably a moron. I mean, in a literal sense of like having 70 IQ points. But these figurative morons, these postmodern performance artists, they know better. Like, by the way, what did you think of the Banksy thing of him shredding his own painting?
That I kind of appreciated because at the very least it's his own painting and it was a commercial endeavor. And he said, "Okay, fuck you." But what was great to me, the best part, because this shows you the mind of an arts expert very quickly, how it's a bit bullshit artist and a bit huckster. Mm-hmm. As soon as he shredded the painting, he didn't fully shred the painting. It went halfway and stopped. Yeah. The curator at Sotheby said, "Oh, he created a new piece of art because he didn't fully shred it. It became a new thing. So it now bears the act of the event of the shredding, and now it's a new piece of art. And that was wonderful in and of itself." Yeah. That's the mind of an art expert par excellence.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really funny because Banksy released a video. And he shows himself building the frame that shredded the painting and testing it. And in the test, it shredded completely. The shredder malfunctioned, okay, which is actually kind of interesting because now it's halfway shredded. And that element of serendipity adds something oddly to the piece. I have to admit that I respect that because basically he trolled the art market. And I think that for a split second, both the Sotheby's people and the person who purchased the painting must have been fucking horrified. But then the joke weirdly got flipped on Banksy because now the piece, they believe it's worth at least 3 times more than it was originally on offer, that was originally paid for. Can you believe that? Damn
Well,
funny.
yeah, I can. What was interesting, like you said, the failure becoming a work of artistic desire or some wonderful expression is old. The Japanese have a concept like that. They, for some of their vases that they were
Mm-hmm.
making the clayware,
Yeah.
they have a name for it. I've forgotten what it was, but it was a vase that kind of broke. It collapsed during the baking process,
Mm-hmm.
but they patched it up and exhibited that. And it's one of the treasures of the old Japanese art because it shows in the failure of the process. You actually see what the process is, and the Japanese appreciated that. It has a name, and
Mm-hmm.
I've forgotten what it is, but that's what that event kind of reminded me of, and the explanation of. It's weird. People like that, and I get it where it comes from. I wish I knew the word for it, but
I find it funny that I do believe that Banksy wanted to fuck over whoever bought the piece.
oh, I'm sure, no doubt, which I love.
Yeah, I can appreciate it. I can get behind that fully. I think he wanted to fuck him over, and the fact that the guy or the person, I think it's a woman actually, is now has a piece of art worth 3 times more than what she paid for it. It must infuriate him. If I were him, I'd be fucking furious, because it's just it just goes against what he was trying to do, and it's just his trolling was turned on him by the market. It's actually goddamn funny if you think about
Well, that's the joke about a lot of the contemporary art now is that if you think you're especially if you're left wing political minded, if you think your art is going to critique and bring down the edifice of capitalism, the joke's on you because capitalism always figures out a way to make money off of that shit. This is the best example of it.
it.
To your point, he tried to make a critique about the business of the art that is being consumed and give a fuck you middle finger to them, but because of serendipity of how the machine failed, it becomes a work of art in and of itself. Like I said, the great mind of the Sotheby's guy, the hucksterism, saying, oh look, it's a new piece. Yeah, that capitalism will, and the market will convert anything you do into its own little product. And which is why I say the ultimate example to me of how communism is a joke is the Che Guevara t-shirts.
Yeah. Yeah.
You cannot, you can't do anything against capitalism that it can't convert into something it can buy and sell, usually, or at least in that sense. Maybe if someone will figure out a way to do it, but it's very pernicious. And yes, in
Yeah, but
art,
how come we can't have like Andy Warhol painting of Augusto Pinochet, for instance?
well, part of the reason you can't have it is because he never did it.
Well, apart from that obvious fact, but I mean, why couldn't you have a painting, a T-shirt of Augusto Pinochet?
Oh, you could. I think. I think you could give it a couple years. You'll see some Mi General T-shirts if they aren't already in existence.
Mm. I think that would be a good idea. you know,
Is that your new business venture? You want to have some Mi General? Uh,
General. Yeah, the G is pronounced like that kind of sound.
okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that would be cool. I'll have Mi General LLC kind of thing. And pictures of a helicopter with somebody falling. And a smiling general with too much. What do you call brocade? What's it called?
Brocade.
Brocade. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because he had a weakness for brocade. Yeah, that would be damn funny if you ask me. No, but in all seriousness, going back to the what we were talking about of art and museums and such, I found the article, by the way, And it's true. They are distorted marketing thinking causes archaeologists to destroy objects from the Viking era. What they did was they threw it away as scrap metal. These were, things that were of the Viking era, metalcraft, that were definitely from the Viking era that they decided to throw away. How difficult is it to keep a few trinkets? I mean, in these buildings.
Admittedly, surprisingly, it is rather difficult to keep some of those things in a way that preserves them. I know in like in the Oriental Institute, I brought it up. For everything you see outside, you go below into the archives. There's like 10 to 15 times more stuff, and it takes up a huge amount of space. This is the secret of a lot of these museums, is they have a lot of stuff in the background, and it is hard to take care of some of that stuff. Now,
Yeah.
you would have think that, hey, it's your country's history, figure it out. You would think would have been the motivating factor, but Sweden's a weird place, as we know.
Goddamn right it is. Yeah. They're weird people who are committing some sort of weird demographic suicide. So leave them to it. I'm just gonna miss the blonde, blue-eyed, busty Swedish girls. But well, we always have
those genetics got transferred to Poland and Russia. So
yeah, but we always have Norway. The Norwegians don't seem to have any problem with this. But, okay, I don't want to talk about that because that's off topic. But at one point, I do want to talk about why the Norwegians, who are a rich country, unlike the Swedes, who only pretend to be rich, the Norwegians, who have all that offshore oil and that huge sovereign fund that they keep, for a rainy day, as they should, and live well within their means. How come it was the Swedes who went on this weird demographic suicide, not the Norwegians? But that's a prelude to our next conversation. Going back to this thing of art, my original question still stands, which is, who is supposed to decide what gets picked? Do we leave it to the professional museum curators, or what? One of the things I loved about American culture, and just a quick note, the American culture, they have this habit of some random guy deciding, I'm going to build a museum. I'm going to build a museum about the shit that I like. And he makes a museum by the side of the road with whatever he liked. I mean, Pez dispensers or toothpicks or whatever the hell. And it becomes like the world center for Pez dispensers or toothpicks or Star Wars memorabilia or whatever the hell, I mean, I love that. I think that is incredible. And it just seems, it's the only country in the world where random people will decide that they're going to make a museum of the shit that they like, and more power to the Americans who think that way, to anybody of any culture, of any country who thinks that way. But who gets to pick? This is a real question.
Well, clearly we know who's, whoever gets the appointment in the museum is going to cultivate it, pick how a museum, you want to choose. If it's a state museum, like a lot of perhaps the European ones, it's, either political appointment or who when In the United States, when it's, they're private endowments, it's who can donate the most money and then who has control over the museum system. It will vary, but at the end of the day, my response is always this, and I had mentioned it earlier in the episode. You're going to have to, you should be expected to bring some sort of context with you if you're going into the museum, or more importantly, if you are interested in the history of art, you start looking at and accumulating all the various books that you can on the topic, because otherwise you become dependent on the asshole who put the little shit together. And that asshole will sometimes he's very good. He wants to do an interesting retrospective and he's very honest about it. Other times he or she may say, like, we need to, show the truth about patriarchies, whatever. And you're going to get who you're going to get. I mean, that's what's going to happen. It's very similar. Any recommendation I have would be very similar to how you would consume news, right? You have to take a lot of things with a grain of salt. You have to read things orthogonally or like off to the side. Read between the lines and don't assume that the person talking to you knows exactly what you should know or gives you the point of view that's, that has the most merit. Ultimately, it's the same thing. You just have different media that are wrapped around to talk about.
Well said. Well said. And so on that note, I think that we're going to call it a podcast. So this has been the Coach and Benway podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed the show. And thank you very much for joining us, and we will catch you next time.
Later.